Hello and welcome to this video and to March's book review. So as you know, I had to film February's a bit earlier, so we have a couple of books that I've finished technically in February, and then the 4 odd books that I actually read in March. I found myself getting into it's not really a reading slump because I still read pretty much every day, but a bit of a reading slump where I was sort of not really taking in what I was reading and it was having an impact on the book. But when we get to that point, I'll talk about it then. So let's just get on and start with the books. So the first one I read technically in February was Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is a book about 2 sisters. One lives in the Dominican Republic, one lives in the States. They share the same dad, but they don't know that either one exists until the dad's plane crashes and he dies. And that's when they realise that they have a half-sister. This is also all told in verse, which was quite an interesting thing for me, although I'm not sure whether it actually needs to be in verse, but that's my own thoughts. Some people probably love it that way. It did make it very easy to read though, because obviously everything is shorter than in full prose. It's just I didn't feel it being written in verse actually added anything to the story or the connections or anything like that. I think you probably would have got slightly more if it was told in full prose and sentences. This is told in multiple perspectives, so you have thoughts from Camino, who is in the Dominican Republic, and then Yahara, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, who is in the States, and I liked having the dual perspective and hearing about how they each felt finding out that they had a sibling and about how they're both coping with not only the grief of their dad's death but the sort of slight betrayal they feel about him having those 2 sort of families. So that being said, it's a very emotional book, obviously, even though, as I said, it's not quite fully fleshed in the way that it's written. You do still get a whole heap of emotion and understand the relationships and all of that really well, but there was quite a lot of Spanish in this, which frustrates me because obviously I don't speak Spanish, so I don't know whether I missed out on a lot of information or anything like that just because I can't understand the language. I mean, that's partly on me, but yeah, whenever a book has a language that I can't understand and then doesn't give any sort of translation to it, does frustrate me. But yeah, it also gave some interesting cultural representation of, because obviously the 2 girls have a similar, what's the word I'm looking for? It's that sort of nature-nurture debate, because obviously they've both got aspects of their dad, but they're brought up in completely separate places and how that changes their lives kind of thing. So on the whole I did enjoy it. There were a few things that I probably would have changed about it, but definitely one to give a go if you're interested. So that's Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. I must say I'm also doing this rather early in the morning and I haven't properly spoken, so that's why I've got the slightly croaky throat. So the next book I read is The Statistical Probability of Falling in Love at First Sight by Jennifer E. Smith. Yeah, Jennifer E. Smith. This is obviously quite a short YA romance. Again, based around planes. I don't know why I was reading plane books just before we went to Prague, but I was. So in this one, our main character, whose name's Kaylee Hadley, she misses a flight to London for her dad's wedding, so has to go on to the next one, and that's where she meets Oliver and, you know, romance and that ensues. This is an older book. It came out in, when did it come out? So it was first published in 2012, so we're like 10 years since this one was written, and you can kind of tell because YA romances and romances in general have moved on a bit since this. So it was fine, it's just not particularly memorable in what it was saying and what it was doing. But it is a very quick read with very large text, and it was quite sweet, but not quite what I was hoping for, I guess. I think my expectations are probably a bit higher than this one can now reach. So I've said it's a romance, but that's part of the reason probably why it disappointed me, is that the romance isn't really the main factor in it, although it is portrayed on the back as the main factor. A lot of this book is actually more dealing with Hadley's relationship with her dad and the one that she has to sort of hate him because he's gone off and left her mum and her in America and gone to just make a new life with this woman in the UK. But obviously it's still her dad, so she's battling with that feeling. And Oliver is sort of there to help with that a little bit and for that little bit of romance, but it wasn't that sort of butterflies first love kind of feeling that I thought I would get from this book. So I say, it was good, I did enjoy it, probably won't revisit it, so it'll probably go in my unhaul pile. There's a video about that coming soon. Glad I've read it, it's been one on my TBR, my to be read list for a very long time, but it fell slightly short for me. So that was The Statistical Probability of Falling in Love at First Sight by Jennifer E. Smith. It also has an incredibly long title that it doesn't need. So I then went on to my ebook for the month. If you've seen a few of these videos this year, you'll know I am trying to read a book on my Kindle, a non-fiction, and reread each month. They may come and go as we get through the year, we'll see, particularly the non-fiction, which may fall off if I run out of non-fiction. But my Kindle book, because I'm trying to get through some of the books on there, and the one I read this month was The 100 Years of Lenni and Margot by Marianne Cronin. This book follows Lenni and Margot. They're both in a hospital in Glasgow, I believe, both facing terminal illnesses. Lenni is 17, Margot is 83, so together they make 100 years. And they decide to, or they become friends and decide to do some sort of art project where they paint a picture for the 100 years of Lenni and Margot. I picked this book up because on the blurb it appeared that it would be this like cross-generational friendship story, and I quite like those and thought it would be interesting to read. But again, it wasn't quite what I expected. This is sort of the theme I had this month, in that the books just weren't quite what I was expecting. So this one turned out more to be a look back at the 100 years. So as they're painting it, they told the story of what they're painting, so it ends up feeling a bit more like a short story book rather than a novel. And I feel that they didn't really develop that friendship between Margot and Lenni well enough for it to hold any sort of place in your heart, because they're too busy reflecting or going back to each of the years that they're painting. Now don't get me wrong, I did enjoy some of the stories in that, and particularly Margot, because obviously she's got 83 years that she's painting, so she's got a longer life to go. You hear more about her life and backstory. I did enjoy her life and learning about it and where she ends up and all of this, that and the other, but I went into this book expecting a really sweet cross-generational friendship, and I didn't get that. That being said, it did make me laugh at a few points, and I did enjoy Margot as a character. Obviously there's something about my reading taste that I get on really well with 80-odd-year-old old women, because Joyce from the Thursday Murder Club is also one of my favourite characters. If you haven't seen that book review, I'll link it up here. So yeah, I did enjoy what was written, it just wasn't what I was expecting, so it didn't quite hit the mark for me, so I was slightly disappointed with that one. So that was the 100 Years of Lenni and Margot by Marianne Cronin. I then went to my non-fiction pick, which was Marley and Me by John Grogan. This is obviously about Marley and John Grogan, who is a journalist in America. Again, this is quite an old book now, and it's been turned into the film with Owen Wilson and Jennifer Aniston, and I have to say, and I feel a bit bad about it, but I prefer the film. I think you just get more of Marley's personality through the film because you can see the dog rather than on paper, and it's because of the film that I've always been intrigued by the book. I do like a book about dogs. And obviously there were stories in here and things that Marley was doing that I can really relate to, and it did make me laugh at points, and it did obviously make me sad at points, just not quite to the same extremes that the film does. I would also say that this is probably the beginning of my sort of slightly slumpy stage. I did find it quite difficult to sit down and read it, and there were points where I really did have to go, look, come on, you want to read, you want to get through some of, there's a lot of books down here that I want to get to, you need to read this one to be able to do that. So it did become a bit of a chore. Now I don't know whether that's just because of where I was at that time in the month, or whether it was the book or whatever, but the two things did seem to play a part. So I did find this quite a slow read to get through. And obviously, as you get to a spoiler, as you get towards the end of the book, obviously Marley's getting older, the inevitable is happening, and as I got to those pages, obviously I wanted to read it less and less because I don't want to think about dogs aging, because obviously I have one and I don't want to think about that. So it did make me kind of sad and reflective, and I did give Jeff a big old hug once I finished this book. So I found it sweet, it was well written. So some of the stories made me laugh. Obviously there were ones that were in the film that you know about, but there were extras that were not in the film. But I think if I want to revisit Marley and this story, I'm just going to watch the film in future. So that's Marley and Me by John Grogan. So my next two books are actually part of a trilogy, although the third book's not out yet. So I reread Eve of Man by, they go by Giovanna and Tom Fletcher. I think it's Giovanna because I'm sure I once saw on Instagram that she said that her name rhymes with Savannah, so that would be Giovanna. But anyway, the Fletchers. And this book is obviously written by both of them. It follows a society where nobody has girls anymore. If you're pregnant, you're having a boy, there are no girls, and then one girl is born, and she is Eve, and this book picks up from when she's 16 to 18, I can't quite remember the age range there. So this is then her essentially realising what's going on and looking for her freedom. There's a romance. So it's a sort of dystopian YA, think sort of Divergent, Handmaid's Tale, Romeo and Juliet vibes I get from this. And as I said, I was in a slight slump, so I don't actually know whether the feelings I have for this book are the feelings I have for this book, or because of the time that I was reading it. But for a lot of it I wasn't really into it until the last sort of 100 pages, where there felt like there was more action. But as I got onto the sequel, I got really into the world and the story, so I think it might have just been the time. So I've been lenient with my rating, so I gave this a 3.5 stars because of that. I do enjoy the writing of the Fletchers, so this is told in multiple perspectives, so you have chapters from Eve and chapters from Bran. So Giovanna wrote the Eve chapters, Tom wrote the Bran chapters. So I think that dynamic is fun, and I'm always intrigued by books that are written by multiple authors, because I think the process of that must be really interesting and challenging and all of that kind of stuff. So as I said, the book picks up sort of at the 100-page mark where the action comes in, but the world building and all of that is good in this. That was Eve of Man by Giovanna and Tom Fletcher, which I think the sort of tail end of Marley and Me, beginning of that book, was my sort of slumpy stage. I don't know whether it should actually affect the two books that I was reading at the time, because then I got onto the Evolution again by Giovanna and Tom Fletcher, which is the sequel, and I sped through this. I really enjoyed it. There was a point at the beginning where I was really confused with the character that sets this book up, because they're introducing a third perspective into this book from Michael, who is one of the guards who's supposed to look after Eve. I don't really want to say too much about the plot of this book in case you want to read the series, and I don't want to spoil it. So I was a bit confused by that. I also don't know which one of them will have written those chapters, and I kind of would have liked to have known that, but that's my own curiosity more than anything else. So this book picks up literally as Eve of Man finishes, and in fact slightly before. There's a bit of a crossover with it, obviously get a different perspective of that crossover. So there's none of that I wonder what happened in the time between these books, because it literally picks up at the same point, which I liked. I did really enjoy the dynamics in this book between all of the characters. I thought that was really well written. There was a moment where I thought we were just going to be stuck on one plot point and that was going to irritate me, but we did move off. And I would say that Michael's chapters, so that's the third perspective that was brought in, who wasn't really a big part of Eve of Man, but there we go. I would say that his chapters I really enjoyed. They were the best part of this book, and I sort of lost interest slightly in the Eve and Bran chapters, but that's because all of the action was happening in the tower with Michael. And again, as with the last one, the last sort of 100 pages is where the action really ramps up. So the pacing of these books is slightly off in my opinion. I would say though that the big twist at the end was kind of obvious and what I expected, but I look forward to the third and I think final instalment of this trilogy. They're very easy to read if you're into sort of dystopian YA. I wouldn't say they were the best written ones. They certainly fall into some of the tropes of them. You can definitely see elements of, you know, like the Divergent series, the Hunger Games series, etc. in them, but I don't think that's something to write them off because of. I think they're quite good in their own right. So yeah, that was The Evolution by Giovanna and Tom Fletcher. So there you go. There are all the books that I read in the tail end of February and in March. I'm planning on taking part in the Magical Hopathon round 2, which is a 2-week readathon this time, celebrating the 30th anniversary of Disneyland Paris. So make sure you click that subscribe button if you're interested to see what I did for that and what other books I read in April. But on that note, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and I will see you in the next one. Bye!